Station, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 4, Side 2. About 1505 he carved for a Flemish merchant the Madonna that sits in the church of Notre Dame at Bruges. It has been highly praised, but it is one of the artist's poorer works. The drapery simple and dignified, the head of the child quite out of proportion to the body, the face of the Virgin pouting and mournful, as if she felt that it was all a mistake. Still stranger is the homely Virgin in the Madonna, painted in 1505 for Angelo Doni. In truth, Michelangelo did not care much for beauty. He was interested in bodies, preferably male, and represented them sometimes with all the defects of their seen forms, sometimes in a way to convey some sermon or idea, but seldom with a view to catching beauty and imprisoning it in lasting stone. In this Doni Madonna, he offends good taste by placing a row of naked youths on a parapet behind the Virgin. Not that he was paganizing. He was apparently a sincere, even a Puritan Christian. But here, as in the Last Judgment, his fascination with the human body triumphed over his piety. He was deeply interested, too, in the anatomy of position, in what happens to limbs, extremities, frame, and muscles when the body changes its pose. So here the Virgin leans backward, apparently to receive the child over her shoulder from St. Joseph. It is excellent sculpture, but lifeless and almost colorless painting. Michelangelo was to protest time and again that painting was not his forte. Therefore he must have felt no great pleasure when Soderini invited him in 1504 to paint a mural in the hall of the Great Council of the Palazzo Vecchio, while his bête noire, Leonardo da Vinci, was to paint an opposite wall. He disliked Leonardo for 100 reasons. For his aristocratic manners, his costly and pretentious dress, his retinue of pretty youths, perhaps for his greater success and fame, till then, as a painter. Angelo was not sure that he, a sculptor, could rival Leonardo in painting. It was courageous of him to try. For his preliminary cartoon, he set up a panel of linen-backed paper, 288 square feet in area. He had made some progress on this sketch when a summons came to him from Rome. Julius needed the best sculptor to be found in Italy. The Signory fumed, but let Michelangelo go in 1505. Perhaps he was not sorry to leave the pencil and the brush and return to the laborious art that he loved. 2. Michelangelo and Julius II, 1505 to 1513. He must have seen at once that he would be miserable with Julius. They were so much alike. Both had temper and temperament. The Pope, imperious and fiery, the artist somber and proud. Both were Titans in spirit and aim, acknowledging no superior, admitting no compromise, passing from one grandiose project to another, stamping their personalities on their time, and laboring with such mad energy that when both were dead all Italy seemed exhausted and empty. Julius, following the example long since set by the cardinals, wanted for his bones a mausoleum whose size and splendor should proclaim his greatness even to distant and forgetful posterity. He looked with envy upon the beautiful tomb that Andrea Sansovino had just carved for Cardinal Ascanio Sforza in Santa Maria del Popolo. Michael proposed a colossal monument 27 feet in length and 18 in width. 40 statues would adorn it, some symbolizing the redeemed papal states, some personifying painting, architecture, sculpture, poetry, philosophy, theology, all made captive by the irresistible Pope. Others depicting his major predecessors, as for example Moses. 2 would picture angels, one weeping at Julius's removal from the earth, the other smiling at his entrance into heaven. At the top would be a handsome sarcophagus for the mortal papal remains. Along the surfaces of the monument would run bronze reliefs recounting the achievements of the Pope in war, government, and art. All this was to stand in the tribune of St. Peter's. It was a design that would use many tons of marble, many thousands of ducats, many years of the sculptor's life. Julius approved, gave Angelo 2,000 ducats for the purchase of marble, and sent him off to Carrara, instructing him to pick the finest veins. While there, Michael noted a hill overlooking the sea, and conceived the idea of carving the mount into a colossal human figure, which, lighted at the top, would serve as a beacon to distant mariners. But Julius's tomb called him back to Rome. When the marble that he had bought arrived and was piled up in a square by his lodgings near St. Peter's, people marveled at its quantity and cost, and Julius rejoiced. The drama became tragedy. Bramante, desiring money for the new St. Peter's, looked askance at this titanic project. Moreover, he feared that Michelangelo would replace him as the Pope's favorite artist. He used his influence to divert papal funds and passion from the proposed tomb. For his part, Julius was planning war upon Perugia and Bologna in 1506, and found Mars an expensive god. The tomb should wait for peace. Meanwhile, Angelo had received no salary, had spent on marble all that Julius had advanced him, had paid out of his own pocket to furnish the house that the Pope had provided for him. He went to the Vatican on Holy Saturday, 1506, to ask for money. He was told to return on Monday. He did, and was told to return on Tuesday. Like rebuffs met him on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. On Friday he was turned away with the blunt statement that the Pope did not wish to see him. He went home and wrote a letter to Julius. "Most blessed Father, I have been turned out of the palace today by your orders. Wherefore I give you notice that from this time forward, if you want me, you must look for me elsewhere than at Rome." He gave instructions for the sale of the furniture he had bought and took horse toward Florence. At Poggibonsi he was overtaken by couriers bearing a letter from the Pope, which commanded him to return at once to Rome. If we may accept his own account, and he was an unusually honest man, he sent back a reply that he would come only when the Pope agreed to fulfill the conditions of their understanding for the tomb. He continued to Florence. Now he resumed work on the immense cartoon for the Battle of Pisa. He chose as his subject no actual warfare, but the moment when the soldiers, who had been swimming in the Arno, were suddenly called to action. Michael was not concerned with battles. He wanted to study and portray the nude male form in every position. Here was his chance. He showed some men emerging from the river, others running to their weapons, others struggling to pull up stockings on wet legs, others leaping or riding on horseback, others hurriedly adjusting their armor, some running stark naked to the fight. There was no landscape background. Michelangelo never cared for landscape, or for anything in nature except the human form. When the cartoon was finished, it was put alongside Leonardo's in the hall of the Pope in Santa Maria Novella. There the rival sketches became a school for 100 artists: Andrea del Sarto, Alonzo Berrughete, Raphael, Jacopo Sansovino, Perino del Vaga, and 100 more. Cellini, who copied Michelangelo's cartoon about 1513, described it with youthful enthusiasm as so splendid in action that nothing survives of ancient or modern art which touches the same point of lofty excellence. Though the divine Michelangelo in later life finished that great Sistine Chapel, he never rose halfway to the same pitch of power. We cannot say as much. The picture was never painted, the cartoon is lost, and only minor fragments survive of the many copies made. While Angelo was working on the sketch, Pope Julius sent message after message to the Florentine Signory, demanding them to send him back to Rome. Soderini, loving the artist and fearing for his safety in Rome, temporized. After the third letter from the Pope, he begged Angelo to obey, saying that his obstinacy endangered the peaceful relations between Florence and the papacy. Michael demanded a safe conduct, to be signed by the Cardinal of Volterra. During the delay, Julius captured Bologna in November of 1506. Now he sent to Florence a peremptory order that Michelangelo should come to Bologna for an important commission. Armed with a letter from Soderini to Julius, which begged the Pope to show him love and treat him gently, Michael went once more over the snows of the Apennines. Julius received him with a heavy frown, ordered from the room a bishop who presumed to rebuke the artist for disobedience, gave Angelo a grumbling pardon and a characteristic assignment. "I wish you to make my statue on a large scale in bronze. I mean to place it on the façade of San Petronio." Michael was glad to get back to sculpture, though not confident of his ability to cast successfully a sitting figure 14 feet in height. Julius provided 1,000 ducats for the work. Angelo reported later that he had spent all but 4 ducats on materials, so that he had for himself only that reward for 2 years of labor in Bologna. The task was as heartbreaking as that which Cellini described for casting the Loggia Perseus. "I worked night and day," the sculptor wrote to his brother Buonarrota. "If I had to begin the whole thing over again, I do not think I could survive it." In February 1508, the statue was raised to its place above the main portal of the cathedral. In March, Michael returned to Florence, probably praying that he might never see Julius again. 3 years later, as we have seen, the statue was melted into cannon. Almost at once the Pope sent for him. Angelo went back to Rome and was chagrined to find that Julius wanted him not to carve the great tomb, but to paint the ceiling of the chapel of Sixtus IV. He hesitated to face the problems of perspective and foreshortening in painting a ceiling 68 feet above the floor. He protested again that he was a sculptor, not a painter. In vain he recommended Raphael as a better man for the work. Julius commanded and coaxed, pledging a fee of 3,000 ducats, or about $37,500. Michael feared the Pope and needed the money. Still murmuring, "This is not my trade," he undertook the arduous and uncongenial task. He sent to Florence for 5 assistants trained in design, tore down the clumsy scaffolding that Bramante had raised, erected his own, and set to work measuring and charting the 10,000 square feet of the ceiling, planning the general design, making cartoons for each separate space, including spandrels, pendentives, and lunettes. In all, there were to be 343 figures. Many preliminary studies were made, some from living models. When the final form of a cartoon was finished, it was carried carefully up the scaffolding and was applied, face outward, to the freshly plastered surface of its corresponding place. The lines of the composition were then pricked through the drawing into the plaster, the cartoon was removed, and the sculptor began to paint. For over 4 years, from May 1508 to October 1512, Angelo worked on the Sistine ceiling. Not continuously. There were interruptions of uncertain length, as when he went to Bologna to besiege Julius for more funds. And not alone. He had helpers to grind the colors, prepare the plaster, perhaps to draw or paint some minor features. Parts of the frescoes reveal inferior hands. But the 5 artists whom he had summoned to Rome were soon dismissed. Angelo's style of conception, design, and coloring was so different from theirs and the traditions of Florence that he found them more hindrance than aid. Besides, he did not know how to get along with others, and it was one of his consolations, up there on the scaffold, that he was alone. There he could think, in pain but in peace. There he could exemplify Leonardo's saying, "If you are alone, you will be wholly your own." To the technical difficulties, Julius added himself by his impatience to have the great work completed and displayed. Picture the old Pope mounting the frail frame, drawn up to the platform by the artist, expressing admiration, always asking, "When will it be finished?" The reply was a lesson in integrity. "When I have done all that I believe required to satisfy art." To which Julius retorted angrily, "Do you want me to hurl you from this scaffold?" Yielding later to the papal impatience, Angelo took down the scaffolding before all final touches had been applied. Then Julius thought that a little gold should be added here and there, but the weary artist persuaded him that gold trimmings would hardly become the prophets or the apostles. When for the last time Michael descended from the scaffold, he was exhausted, emaciated, prematurely old. A story says that his eyes, long accustomed to the subdued illumination of the chapel, could hardly bear the light of the sun. And another story that he found it now easier to read by looking upward than by holding the page beneath his eyes. The original plan of Julius for the ceiling had been merely a series of apostles. Michelangelo prevailed upon him to allow an ampler and nobler scheme. He divided the convex vault into over 100 panels by picturing columns and moldings between them, and he enhanced the tri-dimensional illusion with lusty youthful figures upholding the cornices or seated on capitals. In the major panels, running along the crest of the ceiling, Angelo painted episodes from Genesis. The initial act of creation separates light from darkness. The sun, moon, and planets come into being at the command of the Creator. A majestic figure, stern of face, powerful of body, with beard and robes flying in the air. The Almighty, even finer in form and feature than in the previous panel, extends his right arm to create Adam, while with the left arm he holds a very pretty angel. This panel is Michelangelo's pictorial masterpiece. God, now a much older and patriarchal deity, evokes Eve from Adam's rib. Adam and Eve eat the fruit of the tree and are expelled from Eden. Noah and his sons prepare a sacrificial offering to God. The flood rises. Noah celebrates with too much wine. All in these panels is Old Testament, all is Hebraic. Michelangelo belongs to the prophets pronouncing doom, not to the evangelists expounding the gospel of love. In the spandrels of alternate arches, Angelo painted magnificent figures of Daniel, Isaiah, Zechariah, Joel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Jonah. In the other spandrels, he pictured the pagan oracles that were believed to have foretold Christ, the graceful Libyan Sibyl, holding an open book for the future, the dark, unhappy, powerful Cumean Sibyl, the studious Persian, the Delphic and Erythraean Sibyls, These, too, are such paintings as rival the sculptures of Phidias. Indeed, all these figures suggest sculpture, and Michelangelo, conscripted into an alien art, transforms it into his own. In the large triangle at one end of the ceiling, and in two others at the other end, the artist still stayed in the Old Testament, with the raising of the brazen serpent in the wilderness, the victory of David over Goliath, the hanging of Haman, the beheading of Holofernes by Judith. Finally, as if by concession and afterthought, in the lunettes and arched recesses above the windows, Angelo painted scenes expounding the genealogy of Mary and Christ. No one of these pictures quite equals Raphael's School of Athens in conception, drawing, color, and technique. But taken all together, they constitute the greatest achievement of any man in the history of painting. The total effect of repeated and careful contemplation is far greater than in the case of the stanze. There we feel a happy perfection of artistry and an urbane union of pagan and Christian thought. Here we do not merely perceive technical accomplishments. In the perspective, the foreshortenings, the unrivaled variety of attitudes, we feel the sweep and breath of genius, almost as creative as in the windswept figure of the Almighty raising Adam out of the earth. Here again Michelangelo has given his ruling passion free rein, and though the place was the chapel of the popes, the theme and object of his art was the human body. Like the Greeks, he cared less for the face and its expression than for the whole physical frame. On the Sistine ceiling are half a dozen male, a few female nudes. There are no landscapes, no vegetation except in picturing the creation of plants, no decorative arabesques. As in Signorelli's frescoes at Orvieto, the body of man becomes the sole means of decoration as well as of representation. Signorelli was the one painter, as Jacopo della Quercia was the one sculptor, from whom Michelangelo cared to learn. Every little space left free in the ceiling by the general pictorial plan is occupied by a nude figure, not so much beautiful as athletic and strong. There is no sexual suggestion in them, only the persistent display of the human body as the highest embodiment of energy, vitality, life. Though some timid souls protested against this profusion of nudity in the house of God, Julius made no recorded objection. He was a man as broad as his hatreds, and he recognized great art when he saw it. Perhaps he understood that he had immortalized himself not by the wars that he had won, but by giving the strange and incalculable divinity fretting in Angelo freedom to disport itself on the papal chapel vault. Julius died 4 months after the completion of the Sistine ceiling. Michelangelo was then nearing his 38th birthday. He had placed himself at the head of all Italian sculptors by his David and Pietà. By this ceiling he had equaled or surpassed Raphael in painting. There seemed no other world left for him to conquer. Surely even he hardly dreamed that he had over a half a century yet to live, that his most famous painting, his most mature sculpture, were yet to be done. He mourned the passing of the great Pope, and wondered whether Leo would have as sure an instinct as Julius for the noble in art. He retired to his lodgings, and bided his time. Chapter 18. Leo X, 1513 to 1521. 1. The Boy Cardinal. The Pope that gave his name to one of the most brilliant and immoral ages in the history of Rome owed his ecclesiastical career to the political strategy of his father. Lorenzo de' Medici had been almost destroyed by Sixtus IV. He hoped that the power of his family and the security of his progeny in Florence would be helped by having a Medici sitting in the College of Cardinals in the inner circles of the Church. He destined his second son for the ecclesiastical state almost from Giovanni's infancy. At 7, in 1482, the boy was given the tonsure. Soon he was dowered with benefices in commendam. That is, he was made absentee beneficiary of church properties and received their surplus revenue. At the age of 8, he was given the abbacy of Fondeuse in France. At 9, the rich abbey of Passignano. At 11, the historic abbey of Monte Cassino. Before his election to the papacy, Giovanni had collected 16 such benefices. At 8, he was appointed protonotary apostolic. At 14, he was made a cardinal. It should be recalled that one might become a cardinal without being a priest, and that cardinals were chosen for their political ability and connections rather than for religious qualities. The young prelate was provided with all the education available to a millionaire's son. He grew up amid scholars, poets, statesmen, and philosophers. He was tutored by Marsilio Ficino. He learned Greek from Demetrius Chalcondyles, philosophy from Bernardo da Bibbiena, who became one of his cardinals. From the collections of art and the conversations about art in or around his father's palace, he imbibed that taste for the beautiful which was almost a religion to him in his mature years. From his father, perhaps, he learned the profuse and sometimes reckless generosity and the gay, almost Epicurean manner of life which were to distinguish his cardinalate and his pontificate, with far-reaching results to the Christian world. At 13, he entered the university that his father had re-established at Pisa. There, for 3 years, he studied philosophy and theology, canon and civil law. When at 16 he was allowed openly to join the College of Cardinals in Rome, Lorenzo sent him off on March 12, 1492, with one of the most interesting letters in history. You, and all of us who are interested in your welfare, ought to esteem ourselves highly favored by Providence, not only for the many honors and benefits bestowed on our house, but more particularly for having conferred upon us, in your person, the greatest dignity we have ever enjoyed. This favor, in itself so important, is rendered still more so by the circumstances with which it is accompanied, and especially by the consideration of your youth and of our situation in the world. The first thing that I would therefore suggest to you is that you ought to be grateful to God, and continually to recollect that it is not through your merits, your prudence, or your solicitude that this event has taken place, but through His favor, which you can only repay by a pious, chaste, and exemplary life, and that your obligations to the performance of these duties are so much the greater, as in your early years you may have given some reasonable expectation that your riper age may produce such fruits. Endeavor, therefore, to alleviate the burden of your early dignity by the regularity of your life, and by your perseverance in those studies which are suitable to your profession. It gave me great satisfaction to learn that in the course of the past year you had frequently, of your own accord, gone to communion and confession. Nor do I conceive that there is any better way of obtaining the favor of heaven than by habituating yourself to a performance of these and similar duties. I well know that as you are now to reside at Rome, that sink of all iniquity, the difficulty of conducting yourself by these admonitions will be increased. The influence of example is itself prevalent, but you will probably meet with those who will particularly endeavor to corrupt and incite you to vice, because, as you may yourself perceive, your early attainment to so great a dignity is not observed without envy, and those who could not prevent your receiving that honor will secretly endeavor to diminish it by inducing you to forfeit the good estimation of the public, thereby precipitating you into that gulf into which they themselves have fallen, in which attempt the consideration of your youth will give them a confidence of success. To these difficulties you ought to oppose yourself with the greater firmness, as there is at present less virtue amongst your brethren of the college. I acknowledge, indeed, that several of them are good and learned men, whose lives are exemplary, and whom I would recommend to you as patterns of your conduct. By emulating them you will be so much the more known and esteemed, in proportion as your age and the peculiarity of your situation will distinguish you from your colleagues. Avoid, however, the imputation of hypocrisy. Guard against all ostentation, either in your conduct or in your discourse. Affect not austerity, nor even appear too serious. This advice you will, I hope, in time understand and practice better than I can express it. Yet you are not unacquainted with the great importance of the character which you have to sustain, for you well know that all the Christian world would prosper if the cardinals were what they ought to be, because in such a case there would always be a good pope, upon which the tranquillity of Christendom so materially depends. Endeavor then to render yourself such that, if all the rest resembled you, we might expect this universal blessing. To give you particular directions as to your behavior and conversation would be a matter of no small difficulty. I shall therefore only recommend that in your intercourse with the cardinals and other men of rank, your language be unassuming and respectful. On this your first visit to Rome it will, however, be more advisable for you to listen to others than to speak much yourself. On public occasions let your equipage and dress be rather below than above mediocrity. A handsome house and a well-ordered family will be preferable to a great retinue and a splendid residence. Silk and jewels are not suitable for persons in your station. Your taste will be better shown in the acquisition of a few elegant remains of antiquity or in the collecting of handsome books, and by your attendants being learned and well-bred rather than numerous. Invite others to your house oftener than you receive invitations. Practice neither too frequently. Let your own food be plain, and take sufficient exercise, for those who wear your habit are soon liable, without great caution, to contract infirmities. Confide in others too little rather than too much. There is one rule which I would recommend to your attention in preference to all others. Rise early in the morning. This will not only contribute to your health, but will enable you to arrange and expedite the business of the day. And as there are various duties incident to your station, such as the performance of divine service, studying, giving audience, etc., you will find the observance of this admonition productive of the greatest utility. You will probably be desired to intercede for the favors of the Pope on particular occasions. Be cautious, however, that you trouble him not too often, for his temper leads him to be most liberal to those who weary him least with their solicitations. This you must observe, lest you should give him offense, remembering also at times to converse with him on more agreeable topics. And if you should be obliged to request some kindness from him, let it be done with that modesty and humility which are so pleasing to his disposition. Farewell. Lorenzo died less than a month later, and Giovanni had hardly reached the sink of iniquity when he hurried back to Florence to support his elder brother Piero in a precarious inheritance of political authority. It was one of Giovanni's rare misfortunes that he was again in Florence when Piero fell. To escape the indiscriminate wrath of the citizens against the Medici family, he disguised himself as a Franciscan friar, made his way unrecognized through hostile crowds, and applied for admission to the monastery of San Marco, which his forebears had lavishly endowed, but which was at the time under the command of his father's enemy, Savonarola. The friars refused him admission. He hid for a time in a suburb, and then made his way over the mountains to join his brothers in Bologna. Disliking Alexander VI, he avoided Rome. For 6 years he lived as a fugitive or in exile, but apparently never out of funds. With his cousin Giulio, later Clement VII, and some friends, he visited Germany, Flanders, and France. Finally, reconciling himself to Alexander, he took up his residence in Rome in 1500. Everybody there liked him. He was modest, affable, and unostentatiously generous. He sent substantial gifts to his old teachers Politian and Chalcondyles. He collected books and works of art, and even his ample income hardly sufficed for his aid to poets, artists, musicians, and scholars. He enjoyed all the arts and graces of life. Nevertheless, Guicciardini, who lost no love on the popes, described him as having the reputation of a chaste person and of unblameable manners. And Aldus Manutius complimented him on his pious and irreproachable life. His vicissitudes were resumed when Julius II appointed him papal legate to govern Bologna and the Romagna in 1511. He accompanied the papal army to Ravenna, walked unarmed amid the battle, encouraged the soldiers, stayed too long on the field of defeat, administering the sacraments to the dying, and was captured by a Greek detachment in the service of the victorious French. Taken as a prisoner to Milan, he was pleased to note that even the French soldiers paid little attention to the schismatic cardinals and their peregrinating council, but came eagerly to him for his blessing, his absolution, perhaps his purse. He escaped from his lenient captors, joined the Spanish papal forces that sacked Prato and took Florence, and shared with his brother Giuliano in the restoration of the Medici to power in 1512. A few months later he was called to Rome to take part in selecting a successor to Julius. He was still only 37 and could hardly have expected that he himself would be chosen pope. He entered the conclave in a litter, suffering from an anal fistula. After a week of debate and apparently without simony, Giovanni de' Medici was elected on March 11, 1513, and took the name of Leo X. He was not yet a priest, but this defect was remedied on March 15th. Everybody was surprised and delighted. After the dark intrigues of Alexander and Caesar Borgia, and the wars and turbulence and tantrums of Julius, it was a relief that a young man already distinguished for his easygoing good nature, his tact and courtesy, and his opulent patronage of letters and art, was now to lead the Church, presumably in the ways of peace. Alfonso of Ferrara, so relentlessly fought by Julius, had no fear in coming to Rome. Leo reinvested him with all his ducal dignities, and the grateful prince held the stirrup as Leo mounted a horse to ride in the coronation procession of March 17th. These inauguration ceremonies were lavish beyond any precedent, costing 100,000 ducats. The banker, Agostino Chigi, provided a float on which a Latin inscription proclaimed hopefully, "Once Venus," Alexander, "reigned, then Mars," Julius, now Pallas, wisdom, rules. A pithier epigram ran the rounds. Mars was, Pallas is, I, Venus, will always be. Poets, sculptors, painters, goldsmiths rejoiced. Humanists promised themselves a revival of the Augustan age. Never had a man mounted the pontifical chair under more favorable auspices of public approbation. Leo himself, if we may believe the scribblers of the time, said pleasantly to his brother Giuliano, "Godiamoci il papato, poiché Dio ci l'ha dato." Let us enjoy the papacy, since God has given it to us. The remark, possibly apocryphal, indicated no irreverence, but a blithe spirit, ready to be generous as well as happy, and ingenuously unaware amid its good fortune that half of Christendom was swelling with revolt against the Church. 2. The Happy Pope. He began with excellent measures. He forgave the cardinals who had staged the anti-council of Pisa and Milan. That threat of schism ended. He promised, and kept his promise, to refrain from touching the estates left by cardinals. He reopened the Lateran Council and welcomed the delegates in his own graceful Latin. He effected some minor ecclesiastical reforms and reduced taxes. But his edict calling for larger reforms on May 3, 1514, encountered so much opposition from the functionaries whose incomes it would abate that he made no strenuous effort to enforce it. "I will think the matter over," he said, "and see how I can satisfy everybody." This was his character, and his character was his fate. Raphael's portrait of him in the Pitti, painted between 1517 and 1519, is not as well known as that of Julius, but that was partly Leo's fault. There were in this case less depth of thought, heroism of action, and worth of inner soul to give majesty to the outward face and frame. The representation is merciless. A massive man of more than medium height and much more than medium weight, the indignity of obesity concealed under a fur-trimmed robe of velvet white and cape of scarlet red. Hands, soft and flabby, here shorn of the many rings that normally adorned them. A reading glass to help short-sighted eyes, round head and plump cheeks, full lips and double chin, large nose and ears, some lines of bitterness from the nose to the corners of the mouth, heavy eyes and slightly frowning brow. This is the Leo disillusioned with diplomacy and perhaps soured with the unmannerly Reformation, rather than the light-hearted hunter and musician, the generous patron, the cultivated hedonist whose accession had so gladdened Rome. To do him justice, the record must be added to the picture. A man is many men, to divers men and times, and not even the greatest portraitist can show all these features in one moment's face. The basic quality in Leo, born of his fortunate life, was good nature. He had a pleasant word for everybody, saw the best side of everybody, except the Protestants, whom he could not begin to understand, and gave so generously to so many that even this profuse philanthropy, involving heavy drafts on Christian purses, shared in causing the Reformation. We hear much of his courtesy, his tact, his amiability, his cheerful temper, even in sickness and pain. His fistula, repeatedly operated upon, always returned and sometimes made locomotion an agony. So far as he could, he let others lead their own lives. His initial moderation and kindliness yielded to severity when he discovered some cardinals plotting against his life. At times he was relentlessly hard, as with Francesco Maria della Rovere of Urbino and Gian Paolo Baglioni of Perugia. He could lie like a diplomat when he had to, and now and then bettered the instruction of the treacherous statesmanship that enmeshed him. More often he was humane, as when he forbade, in vain, the enslavement of American Indians, and did his best to check the inquisitorial ferocity of Ferdinand the Catholic. Despite his general worldliness, he fulfilled conscientiously all his religious duties, observed the fasts, and recognized no inherent contradiction between religion and gaiety. He has been charged with saying to Bembo, "It is well known to all ages how profitable this fable of Christ has been to us." But the sole authority for this is a violent polemic work, The Pageant of Popes, written about 1574 by an obscure Englishman, John Bale, B-A-L-E, and the free-thinking Bale, B-A-Y-L-E, and the Protestant Roscoe alike reject the story as itself a fable. His enjoyments ranged from philosophy to buffoons. He had learned at his father's table to appreciate poetry, sculpture, painting, music, calligraphy, illumination, textiles, vases, glass, all the forms of the beautiful, except perhaps their source and norm, woman. And though his enjoyment of the arts was too indiscriminate to be a guide to taste, his patronage of artists and poets carried on in Rome the magnanimous traditions of his ancestors in Florence. He was too easygoing to take philosophy to heart. He knew how precarious all conclusions are, and did not bother his head with metaphysics after his college days. At meals he had books read to him, usually of history, or he listened to music. There his taste was sure. He had a good ear and a melodious voice. He kept several musicians at his court and paid them lavishly. The improvisatore, Bernardo Accolti, called Unico Aretino because of his birth in Arezzo and his unequaled facility in impromptu poetry and music, was able, with the fees that Leo paid him, to buy the little duchy of Nepi. A Jewish lute player earned a castle and the title of count. The singer Gabriele Marino was made an archbishop. Under Leo's care and encouragement, the Vatican choir reached an unprecedented degree of excellence. Raphael rightly pictured the Pope as reading a book of sacred music. Leo collected musical instruments for their beauty as well as their tone. One was an organ adorned with alabaster, and judged by Castiglione to be the loveliest that he had ever seen or heard. Leo liked also to keep at his court a number of jesters and buffoons. This accorded with the custom of his father and of contemporary kings, and did not altogether shock a Rome that loved laughter only next to wealth and venery. To our hindsight it seems offensive that jests light or coarse should have echoed through the papal court while the Reformation raged in Germany. It amused Leo to see one of his monk buffoons swallow a pigeon at a mouthful, or 40 eggs in succession. He received with pleasure from a Portuguese embassy a white elephant, brought from India, which genuflected thrice on meeting his holiness. To bring him a person whose wit, deformity, or imbecility could refresh his mirth was an open sesame to his heart. He seems to have felt that to indulge in such diversions now and then would distract him from physical pain, relieve his mind of cosmic worries, and prolong his life. There was something disarmingly childlike about him. Occasionally he would play cards with cardinals, allow the public to sit in as spectators, and then distribute gold pieces to the crowd. Above all other amusements, he loved to hunt. It controlled his tendency to corpulence and allowed him to enjoy the open air and the countryside after being a prisoner of the Vatican. He kept a large stable with 100 grooms. It was his custom to devote nearly all of October to the chase. His physicians highly approved of his addiction, but his master of ceremonies, Paris de Gracie, complained that the Pope kept his heavy boots on so long that no one can kiss his feet, at which Leo laughed heartily. We get a kindlier view of the Pope than in Raphael's picture when we read how the peasants and villagers would come to greet him as he passed along their roads, and would offer him their modest gifts, which were so handsomely returned by the pontiff that the people eagerly awaited his hunting trips. To the poor girls among them he gave marriage dowries. He paid the debts of the sick or aged, or the parents of large families. These simple folk loved him more sincerely than the 2,000 persons who made up his ménage at the Vatican. But Leo's court was no mere focus of amusement and hilarity. It was also the meeting place of responsible statesmen, and Leo was one of them. It was the center of the intellect and wit of Rome, the place where scholars, educators, poets, artists, and musicians were welcomed or housed, the scene of solemn ecclesiastical functions, ceremonious diplomatic receptions, costly banquets, dramatic or musical performances, poetical recitations, and exhibitions of art. It was without question the most refined court in the world at that time. The labors of popes from Nicholas V to Leo himself, in the improvement and adornment of the Vatican, in the assemblage of literary and artistic genius, and of the ablest ambassadors in Europe, made the court of Leo the zenith, not of the art, for that had come under Julius, but of the literature and brilliance of the Renaissance. In mere quantity of culture, history had never seen its equal, not even in Periclean Athens or Augustan Rome. The city itself prospered and expanded as Leo's gathered gold flowed along its economic arteries. In 13 years after his accession, said the Venetian ambassador, 10,000 houses were built in Rome, chiefly by newcomers from northern Italy following the migration of the Renaissance. Florentines in particular crowded in to pick plums from a Florentine pontificate. Paolo Jovio, who moved in Leo's court, estimated the population of Rome at 85,000. It was not yet so fair a city as Florence or Venice, but it was now by common consent the hub of Western civilization. Marcello Alberini, in 1527, called it the rendezvous of the world. Leo, amid amusements and foreign affairs, regulated the importation and price of food, abrogated monopolies and corners, reduced taxes, administered justice impartially, struggled to drain the Pontine marshes, promoted agriculture in the Campagna, and continued the work of Alexander and Julius in opening or improving streets in Rome. Like his father in Florence, he provided circenses as well as panem, engaged artists to plan gorgeous pageants, encouraged the masked festivities of Carnival, even allowed Borgian bullfights to be staged in St. Peter's Square. He wished the people to share in the happiness and jollity of the new golden age. The city took its cue from the Pope and let joy be unconfined. Prelates, poets, parasites, panders, and prostitutes hurried to Rome to drink the golden rain. The cardinals, dowered by the pontiffs and above all by Leo, with innumerable benefices that sent them revenues from all parts of Latin Christendom, were now far richer than the old nobility, which was sinking into economic and political decay. Some cardinals had an income of 30,000 ducats a year, or $375,000. They lived in stately palaces, manned by as many as 300 servants, and adorned with every art and luxury known to the time. They did not quite think of themselves as ecclesiastics. They were statesmen, diplomats, administrators. They were the Roman Senate of the Roman Church, and they proposed to live like senators. They smiled at those foreigners who expected of them the abstinence and continence of priests. Like so many men of their age, they judged conduct not by moral but by aesthetic standards. A few commandments might be broken with impunity if it was done with courtesy and taste. They surrounded themselves with pages, musicians, poets, and humanists, and now and then dined with courtly courtesans. They mourned that their salons were normally womanless. All Rome, according to Cardinal Bibbiena, says that nothing is wanting here but a Madonna to hold a court. They envied Ferrara, Urbino, and Mantua, and rejoiced when Isabella d'Este came to spread her robes and feminine graces over their unisexual feast. Manners, taste, good conversation, appreciation of art were now at their height, and patronage was opulent. There had been cultivated circles in the smaller capitals, and Castiglione preferred the quiet coterie of Urbino to the cosmopolitan, noisier, flashier civilization of Rome. But Urbino was a tiny island of culture. This was a stream, a sea. Luther came and saw it and was shocked and repelled. Erasmus came and saw it and was charmed to ecstasy. 100 poets proclaimed that the Saturnia Regna had returned. 3. Scholars. On November 5, 1513, Leo issued a bull uniting two impoverished institutions of learning. The Studium Sacri Palatii, the College of the Holy Palace, that is, the Vatican, and the Studium Urbis, or City College. These now became the University of Rome, and were housed in a building soon known as the Sapienza. These schools had prospered under Alexander, but languished under Julius, who diverted their funds to war and preferred a sword to a book. Leo supported the new university handsomely until he too was enmeshed in the expensive game of competitive destruction. This book is continued on Cassette 5, Side 1.